On land, in the sky, on the seas, and even below. U.S. military hardware on display, meant to send a clear message to the DPRK.
North Korea is a big problem, and we will deal with that very strongly.
There are already some 28,000 U.S. troops stationed in the Republic of Korea working alongside ROK troops, and Washington is now reportedly considering a range of new military options, including deploying small, short-range tactical U.S. nuclear missiles. U.S. nuclear weapons were removed from the ROK in 1991. Jenny Town is deputy director of the U.S. Korea Institute at Johns Hopkins University. She says some hardliners in Seoul support the return of tactical nukes to the ROK.
They see this as the way to protect themselves against the growing North Korea threat. And I think there is still some concern as to whether or not the U.S. really will come to the aid of South Korea and how strong that alliance is if something should break out.
The U.S. already has long-range missiles and submarines that could strike the DPRK with nuclear weapons. So Town says U.S. nukes on ROK soil would be largely meant to project strength, while adding more instability to an already tense situation, possibly even prompting the DPRK to launch a preemptive strike.
You can expect some very harsh reactions from North Korea, a lot more rhetoric. It might increase the pace of which they develop their nuclear weapons program. But then also dealing with the Japanese issue as well. What happens if South Korea gets tactical nuclear weapons? Will then Japan want tactical nuclear weapons? And then how does China respond to all of that?
China has again come out strong on its opposition to the deployment of the U.S. anti-missile system to South Korea. In a regular press briefing, Beijing's foreign ministry spokesman Gang Sheng called for an immediate halt to it, adding that China will take necessary measures to protect its interests. Such comments come as a U.S. defense official told AFP that THAAD has now reached initial intercept capability, meaning it can defend against North Korean missiles. Reuters, citing other U.S. officials, confirmed that, but said the battery would not be fully operational for months.
Now, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency is warning that there are no signs North Korea is putting the brakes on its nuclear weapons program. Speaking at the preparatory committee for the 2020 review conference on the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, Yukiya Amano said he was extremely worried as all indications suggest Pyongyang is making progress with its nuclear efforts. He urged the regime to cooperate with the IAEA in implementing safeguards to fully comply with its obligations under relevant UN Security Council resolutions and resolve any outstanding issues. Amano also said his inspectors are ready to return to North Korea at short notice if political conditions allow it. North Korea withdrew from the NPT in 2003 and expelled IAEA inspectors 6 years later.
Fox News alert. This just coming into our newsroom. The U.S. Air Force firing its second long-range missile test in just 1 week as tensions run high with North Korea. Brand new video just coming into our newsroom, as I said, as the unarmed nuclear-capable missile is blasted from a California airbase overnight. It's expected to splash down in the Pacific more than 4,000 miles offshore.
President Trump spoke with Russian leader Vladimir Putin on the phone today. Yesterday, the president said he's willing to meet with North Korea's dictator. Tomorrow, President Trump will host the head of the Palestinian Authority. He has also extended an invitation to the leader of the Philippines, who's been accused of human rights violations. Tonight, correspondent Rich Edson at the State Department looks at the American president's willingness to engage with some of the world's most authoritarian leaders.
He told the last U.S. president to go to hell. This U.S. president has invited him to the White House. Rodrigo Duterte is president of the Philippines. Human rights groups say he is prosecuting a deadly drug war responsible for the deaths of thousands of Filipinos and has publicly threatened to kill drug dealers and addicts.
He's been very, very tough on that drug problem, but he has a massive drug problem. If he comes to the White House, that's fine. I look forward to meeting him.
Democrats have also criticized President Trump for saying he'd meet with North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un under certain conditions. The president congratulated Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan on a referendum that helped him consolidate power, invited Thailand's prime minister to the White House, and has already hosted Egyptian President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi.
We are very much behind President el-Sisi.
praise and invitations for world leaders human rights groups say are consistent violators of democratic principles. State Department officials say they often raise concerns about how these governments treat their citizens, adding they have discussed their differences with Philippine officials about their approach to the drug war. The White House says President Trump wants to meet with President Duterte to discuss an urgent regional problem, North Korea's aggression. Duterte has rebuffed President Trump's offer, saying he is too busy with travel plans to Russia and Israel. The United States has also partnered for decades with leaders who have oppressed their citizens. One example, Saudi Arabia. Though one Republican senator says there is a difference.
They are a very important ally in the Middle East, and so I would not compare the Saudi Arabian country and government with that of a Filipino dictator who is now violating all basic human rights laws with extrajudicial killing.
And then there's the leader President Trump has received the most criticism for praising, Russian President Vladimir Putin. The two spoke today. They've also recently highlighted how the U.S.-Russia relationship has reached a low point, especially since President Trump's inauguration.
Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have held an urgent phone call in which they discussed the Syrian crisis and the current tensions around North Korea. Just to give you an impression of how eager everybody was to find out the details, here's a part of the latest White House briefing.
Sean, wait a minute. What about the Putin call? Sean, where'd Sean go?
The White House hasn't actually released much information about the discussion, just calling the talks good and constructive. Moscow, though, did share a few details. Let's get them now. Joining me is RT's Emily Su from downtown Moscow there, just in front of the Kremlin. Good to see you again this morning, Emily. The center of the discussion, what were the main pieces?
Well, Rory, in a statement released by the Kremlin, we know the two world leaders discussed a wide range of issues concerning Syria and North Korea. We know that Putin and Trump has agreed on joint efforts to fight terrorism in Syria and to prevent further violence there. We also know that the two presidents, well, they've discussed on what can be achieved if there's more contact between the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and his Russian counterpart, the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. And on North Korea, well, the Kremlin has described the situation on the Korean Peninsula as dangerous. And on that, Putin has called on all sides to be reserved and to use diplomatic means to resolve the conflict and de-escalate the conflict and ease tensions there. And finally, Putin and Trump have not only agreed on more calls, they've also looked into the possibility of arranging a face-to-face meeting during the G20 summit in the German city of Hamburg come July. Now, as you understand, this is indeed a very busy time geopolitically speaking, with so many pressing issues at hand, and certainly North Korea and the fight against terrorism in Syria is on the top of that list. And perhaps that is why there is so much hype surrounding this Putin-Trump phone call, as both the U.S. and Russia are perceived as the two major world powers that can put an end to the conflict in the war-torn country. And later on Wednesday, Putin is scheduled to meet with the Turkish president to discuss that very same issue, the fight against terrorism.
Well, the war in Syria is likely to top the agenda when Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan meets Russian President Vladimir Putin in Sochi. They are also expected to discuss energy cooperation as well as trade and tourism. But just ahead of the meeting, Erdogan once again stressed the urgent need to find a solution to the crisis in Syria.
Suriye'de akan kanın bir an önce durması.
Turkey and Russia have a common goal in Syria. We want to stop the bloodshed and find a political solution to the war. It's time for the countries that have influence in Syria to take on the responsibility. Turkey, with its 911-kilometer border with Syria, is under threat of attacks. And we can't stay silent any longer in the face of innocent civilians being killed in Syria. So the ceasefire should be consolidated.
Iran says it will continue to support the Syrian government by sending more advisors and fighters. The ground forces commander of the Revolutionary Guards said Iran would send more advisors to the resistance front. Iran has also sent volunteer fighters recruited among its own nationals and Shiite communities in neighboring countries.
Such an agreement.
According to NBC News, Donald Trump is convinced that the Mideast should no longer be driven by violence and that peace is within reach. A possible step in the direction of peace will be his meeting with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas on Wednesday. According to Ghassan Khatib, a professor of political science at Birzeit University in the West Bank, Trump may be underestimating the task at hand. He said the main concern for Palestinians is to make him understand that there are two sides, that the second side is important. This second side is the Palestinian version of a long-running struggle that many, such as Khatib, feel Trump may not possess an in-depth knowledge of.
UNESCO's executive board has described Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem as null and void. The criticism came in a resolution backed by 22 countries, which also criticized Israel's ongoing blockade of the Gaza Strip. However, 10 board members voted against it, including the United States, Germany and Italy. Jordan's ambassador to UNESCO said it is important Israel is held to account.
We so much thank the countries that voted in favor of this draft resolution, and we think that by pursuing tabling this resolution, we will exert diplomatic pressure on Israel as an occupying power to allow for the reactive monitoring mission to go to the old city of Jerusalem, and also implement what we have adopted several resolutions in the past to allow for the special representative for the Director General of UNESCO to go to the old city of Jerusalem and witness the Israeli violations there.
The FBI says it will work to tighten security after the revelation one of its contractors married an ISIS recruiter. American Daniela Green pleaded guilty to one count of lying to the FBI in 2014. Her case was not widely known until this week, following a report by CNN. Dean Reynolds is outside the FBI office in Detroit, where Green worked with a top security clearance. Top secret. Dean, good morning.
Good morning. Well, back in 2014, the FBI here in Detroit assigned Daniela Green as an interpreter on its investigation of Dennis Cuthbert, a top recruiter for ISIS. But 6 months later, she was married to him in Syria. Dennis Cuthbert made a name for himself as the rapper Deso Dog in his native Germany. But after pledging allegiance to ISIS in 2014, he starred in propaganda videos, including this one where he threatened to slit President Obama's throat. That same year, the FBI assigned Daniela Green, who is fluent in German, to help track Cuthbert down. During the investigation, which included Skype conversations with Cuthbert, she apparently began a romance with him. According to unsealed court papers, Green flew to Turkey in June and then crossed over into Syria. She had told the FBI she was visiting her family in Germany.
She would be very attractive from an ISIS standpoint.
Peter Trumbore, a political scientist at Oakland University, studies terror groups.
If they're working under the assumption that she in fact has fallen in love or that she has become radicalized herself, she would be an absolute valuable source of information to ISIS.
Days after marrying Cuthbert in 2014 in Syria, Green admitted she had, quote, made a mess of things. Sometimes I wish I could just come back, she wrote in an email to an unidentified person in the U.S. I don't know how long I'll last here. Somehow she managed to flee Cuthbert and ISIS and was arrested upon her return to the States in August of 2014. She began cooperating with authorities almost immediately.
If she was able to come back and share details of what her travels looked like, then that would be absolutely vital intelligence that the United States would want.
While in Syria, Green even told Cuthbert she worked for the FBI, but prosecutors say she withheld most sensitive information from him. Cuthbert escaped a coalition airstrike in 2015 and is believed to still be alive. Green served 2 years in prison and is now out on probation. Her former attorney told CBS this morning, quote, Danny just got into something way over her head. She's a good person, and she was genuinely remorseful for what happened.
The State Department is warning Americans who plan to travel in Europe to especially be on alert. This comes as 2017 is on pace to become a record year for terrorism arrests and suicide attacks. Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is here tonight to tell us what she's hearing. Good evening, Catherine.
Well, thank you, Brett. The State Department Travel Alert warns U.S. citizens of the continuing threat of terrorist attacks targeting tourist locations, transportation hubs, markets, and shopping malls in Europe. The alert reads in part, recent widely reported incidents in France, Russia, Sweden, and the United Kingdom demonstrate that the Islamic State of Iraq and ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates have the ability to plan and execute terrorist attacks in Europe. According to congressional investigators, the data shows that 6 years after SEAL Team 6 killed Osama bin Laden at this compound in Pakistan, the threat remains high with terrorist-inspired or directed plots focused on civilians. Since 2013, the House Homeland Security Committee reports 198 ISIS-linked plots against the West, with 21 this year alone. And the terror group has taken suicide attacks into the mainstream, with 63 plots against the West, with more than half between 2016 and 2017. The data also shows the growing use of vehicles as weapons. This ISIS-inspired attack in Stockholm last month marked the fourth attack in Europe over 12 months, where the group used a truck or a car against civilian targets to inflict mass casualties. In March, the Homeland Security Department brought in new rules impacting 10 airports in 8 countries, banning electronic devices larger than an iPhone in carry-on luggage. The Republican chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee told Fox today the restrictions are based on solid information pointing to a near-term plot.
On specific and credible intelligence that there is a imminent threat to our aviation sector, and I think the administration took very responsible actions to safeguard the safety of Americans here in the homeland. The war on terror did not end with the death of Osama bin Laden. In fact, there have been more terror plots against the West since his killing than at any time since 9/11.
Analysts also report French and British authorities are seeing a big jump in women getting involved with terrorism, moving beyond support roles to carrying out the operations themselves. Brett.
Captain, thank you.
You're welcome.
The U.S. military could one day use drone submarines and soldier robots armed with machine guns to storm beaches. The Navy and Marine Corps observed more than 100 high-tech prototypes in action as part of the Ship-to-Shore Maneuver Exploration and Experimentation Advanced Naval Technology Exercise 2017, which ran April 19 to 28 at Camp Pendleton Marine Corps Base. Among the new weapons demonstrated were weaponized robots that could storm beaches as a first line of assault. The military also tested out something called a hypersub, which is essentially a speedboat that can transform into a stealthy submarine. According to the U.S. military, in this day and age, it is virtually impossible to surprise the enemy with a large-scale amphibious invasion, like was done in Normandy, France during World War II. Technology like this would help Marines to mount an aggressive beach invasion, all while reducing the risk to soldiers.
Every now and then we hear stories about robots taking away jobs from people. That will likely be a reality in surgery rooms too. Scientists at the University of Utah have created an automated machine that can perform complicated brain surgeries 50 times faster than the standard procedures by hand. To find out more about this technology, I spoke with Dr. William Coldwell, chairman of the Department of Neurosurgery over at the University of Utah.
Certainly, that's a good question. Well, the idea is just like machining a car part. This drill is designed to drill away the bone that we need for the opening. So it's very accurate, within 1 millimeter of accuracy, and it can use the images on the CT scan to drill the bone with great accuracy, just like you see machining for auto parts and that sort of thing. So it's a established technology. We're applying it to drilling the bone. It does it in a much more rapid fashion, in a matter of minutes instead of hours, and it can take a very complex opening and make it quite simple to achieve using the imaging and the programming of the software. So I think that ultimately it will be faster, equally as safe, if not safer, and much more cost effective for the use of the operating room time. So I do think that patients should consider having this being used in their opening.
Well, I'd imagine with the advances in technology that you might have some resistance from patients or their concerned family members. So how do you explain to them that you guys tested this? Or are there any disadvantages that you can point out? Like, what if it breaks in the middle of the procedure?
Well, the idea is that the surgeon stands by. And so the surgeon is always ready to intervene if the device breaks. We also have some safety features that are programmed in the machine that if it gets too close to a nerve and irritates the nerve, it will be an automatic shutoff. And the surgeon can stand by and watch the machine work. And if there's any concern, that they can stop it at any time.
May Day protest in support of women's and workers' rights turned violent in cities around the world. Demonstrators in Paris threw Molotov cocktails at police. 4 officers were hurt. And in the Pacific Northwest, dozens of people were arrested yesterday during clashes with police. John Blackstone shows us how a rally in Oregon's largest city turned chaotic.
Police had to resort to so-called flashbangs to try to break up an unruly crowd in Portland, Oregon Monday. The city was forced to shut down its May Day march after the peaceful protest to support labor and immigration rights turned violent. Anarchists clashed with officers, trashing police vehicles and some businesses. In the Washington state capital of Olympia, police say dozens of people dressed in black hurled rocks and marbles. There were several arrests.
This is a group here that was very focused as a group to really engage us and try to, frankly, assault officers.
The protests were just some of the many demonstrations that took place across the country, from Los Angeles to Chicago and New York. In perhaps a not-so-subtle nod to that now infamous Pepsi commercial, some demonstrators offered police a can of Pepsi, which in some cases wasn't so well received. For the most part, demonstrators came together peacefully, hoping to keep attention on their primary cause.
I'm here to fight for rights for workers, rights for immigrants, rights for everybody. Everybody that works, the working class, we need to be heard.
Next tonight here, a major brawl erupting inside the cabin of a passenger plane. You will see the moment, and it comes just as airline executives face a grilling on the Hill today. Many asking what's happened to flying the friendly skies. Here's ABC's chief business correspondent, Rebecca Jarvis.
Tonight, another brawl aboard a plane.
Someone help! This guy's crazy!
2 passengers duking it out before takeoff on this All Nippon Airways flight from Tokyo to LAX. The airline says that man in red pulled off the plane and arrested.
The biggest issue was the unpredictable nature of this guy, and it made it really dangerous.
Just the latest cabin clash caught on tape as U.S. airline executives today faced a grilling on Capitol Hill about their own customer service.
Passengers are frustrated.
Airlines in the hot seat after this infamous video of a doctor dragged off a United plane.
No customer, no individual should ever be treated the way Mr. Dow was. Ever.
United CEO promising change. American Airlines also apologizing for the way this mother was treated during a dispute over a stroller on their plane.
We did not handle that situation as it should have been handled.
Members of Congress sounding off on everything from prices to fees to delays.
We're kind of sick of it as the consuming Americans, but there will come a day when Congress won't accept it anymore on behalf of the American people.
And the committee chair warning the airlines to get their act together or face new regulations from Congress, which in his words, David, they're not going to like.
Towns and highways are underwater in Missouri this morning. The Merrimack River crested overnight, and much of the state remains under flood warnings. Michelle Miller is in Eureka, that's outside of St. Louis. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning. Well, yesterday about this time, those pumps at this gas station stood dry. But after the Merrimack River crested overnight, breaking an all-time record by ½ a foot, they're standing in several inches of water. And there's growing concern of even more flooding as 4 more inches of rain are forecasted today.
A bird's-eye view shows the extent of the devastating floods across the state of Missouri. Streets seem to disappear into the murky waters.
You all are going to have to decide what side of the river you want to be on.
More than 200 roads remain closed, including large parts of Interstate 44, seen here submerged under feet of water.
This railroad bridge, swallowed up by the rising Merrimack River, collects passing debris instead of providing passage for trains. The St. Louis County Police Department looks like it lives on its own island.
It is so going to hit the bridge.
This home was seen floating down the current river, eventually slamming into a bridge. In downtown Eureka, just outside of St. Louis, community members are coming together to save their city.
This is our community. I live in Eureka. I've been out here since I was 13 years old. I know a lot of these people. We want to keep this community up and running.
Volunteers have been working with the National Guard and even the Coast Guard to help fill and distribute sandbags. So all of these sandbags with all of this plastic are keeping the water out of these businesses.
They are minimizing the water intrusion where the pumps on the other side keep the water from getting up to the level behind it.
About 10 miles away in Fenton, Daryl Davidson is hoping the fortress of sandbags surrounding his mother's home will keep the water away.
If the river wins, the river wins, but we're going to try our best not to let it win this year like it did last year.
About 16 months ago, rare December storm swept through these same river towns, causing damage to hundreds of homes. And this system is going to have a ripple effect through the rest of the country with severe weather in Texas and Louisiana tonight. Nora?
All right, Michelle, thank you.